Welcome back, fellow football fanatics. It's College Football with Sam, and I want to take some of my time on this lovely Friday evening to discuss Oregon football and my thoughts on them in 2025, especially as it pertains to winning the college football playoff and whether or not this year or perhaps future years is a better window of opportunity for Dan Lanning to help Oregon win its first national championship in program history, which is a feat I believe he will achieve. Just whether or not he does this year or next year or the year after that or the years after that, I think it's a matter of when, not if. And I want to discuss whether or not this is the year when Oregon will hoist the national championship trophy. I thought they were going to last season, but evidently I think Lanning and Oregon's coaching staff were good enough, elite enough in a variety of areas to cover up some of the holes they had roster-wise, and I think defensive coordinator adjustments and play-calling-wise, that Ohio State's elite staff and even more so elite NFL roster were able to expose in the Rose Bowl. And ever since that Rose Bowl, a lot of people have been very quiet, very reserved about Oregon, and I kind of want to break through that. So before we resume, to help me break through what I'm going to call the wall of Oregon silence, if that even makes sense, please hit the like button and also hit the notification bell. That way you can help College Football with Sam get into the algorithm, reach more people, share this video around with Oregon fans, and also hit the notification bell so that way you can get notified. I already said it twice, but it is that important to hit the notification bell so you can get notified when I release new content and when we go live Sunday, Monday, and Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, comment your thoughts on Oregon's 2025 season down below, some predictions you have, some facts about the roster that you would like me to know. Correct me if you think I'm wrong at all. I'm very open to criticism here on this channel. Also, tell me what you think about Oregon's 2024 season and why you think a lot of people in media, maybe my perception's wrong, aren't talking about Oregon. It seems like the big channels, the big names are silent about Oregon right now. And I don't know exactly why. I don't. Also, check out the video description to get to the Patreon page, merchandise store, if supporting the channel monetarily is your thing. And also join our Discord server. Link is in the description. Navigate when you're in the Discord server to the hashtag YouTube mailbox channel, and you can ask me a question that I'll turn into a video in there. Anyway, enough of the rambling and enough of talking about that. I don't understand why a lot of people are silent about Oregon this year. Entering the college football playoff, people were talking about how Oregon went 12-0 and they could be the first ever team to go 16-0. I thought they were going to, or that there was a very good chance that they were going to. Some friends of mine were more wise and reserved about Oregon and accurately predicted that, well, they would lose the Rose Bowl game. No one quite expected that dominant of a win for Ohio State, but it happened. Ohio State had the most players selected in the 2025 NFL Draft. They were the best team in college football last year, and they had the two best players, or at least close to the two best players in college football last year. One was a freshman, the other was a sophomore. Pretty phenomenal. And Will Howard was a gamer, a gutsy leader in the playoffs. So Oregon, to a certain degree, ran into a bullet train, and even if the format looked differently, they probably don't beat Ohio State, at least in my opinion. But that doesn't mean that their season was a failure. I mean, they beat Ohio State, and I think they outcoached them in the first game. They went 12-0, and they took care of business against inferior opponents, which Ohio State didn't, for example. Michigan, who many thought would be at least a college football playoff contender and competing for 9 or 10 wins, but perhaps, they didn't take care of business against inferior competition. Washington and Illinois were worse than Michigan last year, but both beat Michigan. Minnesota nearly did. Michigan State nearly did. And the latter was far inferior to Michigan roster-wise, and Minnesota, while close, still didn't have the talent. You look at Illinois. They lost to Minnesota. Got lucky against Rutgers, a little lucky against Kansas. Oregon blew them out. Penn State, honestly, not saying that they were better than Ohio State, but given the home field advantage that they had in that game against Ohio State, the pick six, the turnovers that Ohio State had, they should have won that game, and they didn't. They played with their food at times in that game, which is a direct indictment of James Franklin and the coaching staff that they had in 2024. And then Indiana. Indiana wet the bed against Ohio State. Ohio State was better than they were. Ohio State was favored. They should have won that game. But Indiana, their punter dropped the snap. Their punter punted the football to the opposite side of the field, allowing an athletic Caleb Downs to return it for Ohio State's first punt return for a touchdown in about a decade. And they, against Notre Dame, after like maybe one or two drives where they were able to maybe get close to field goal range, they couldn't do anything until garbage time. Anything. Oregon, first year into the conference, having to travel out east to Michigan, to Purdue, to Wisconsin at several different points. Well, they were able to go 12-0 and then 13-0 and beat Penn State and win the Big Ten championship in another game where they traveled out east. Like, the season was far from a failure. It was Lanning's best season in terms of achievement by a mile in his coaching tenure. I thought that the 2023 Oregon team, and I thought this for much of last year, I thought it ever since their struggles against Idaho in week 1, that 2023 Oregon was better than 2024 Oregon. But 2024 Oregon was better coached. I thought that they had a better defense, or at least more talented players on defense. Turned out it was the latter, because in the Rose Bowl and the Big Ten championship game, that defense really did get exposed. And still, 13-1, undefeated in their first year in a conference. You know how many teams have done that? They've transitioned conferences and gone undefeated and won the conference in their first year moving. I can't remember any team doing that in conference realignment in the 21st century. I can't. Not any team moving from, like Utah moving from the Mountain West to the Pac-12. Colorado moving from the Big 12 to the Pac-12. That took an adjustment. BYU or West Virginia or Cincinnati or UCF moving from any of their conferences to the Big 12. Well, BYU got close, but still didn't do it. And that's a different story altogether. The Big 12 last year was not nearly as tough as the Big 10 was in 2024. A&M, first year in the SEC, they nearly did it. Nearly beat Alabama, but lost enough games to keep them out of the SEC championship game, out of the national title conversation. Just think about how difficult that is. And Oregon achieved at that level. Yes, the Rose Bowl was humiliating, but you know what? They humiliated Penn State's awesome defense last year in Indianapolis. They did some things against Ohio State in the regular season that made Ohio State look skilly, that kind of put Jim Knowles on ice skates a little bit. I think it made Ohio State's coaching staff kind of doubt each other for a bit. That one rule with the 12 men on the field was an example of Lanning in that game, doing everything he could to win, and they just didn't do that day. No pun intended there. And then they went into Ann Arbor, crushed Michigan, even when they had, jet lag, and Michigan was able to put together a better offensive game plan than they had in most prior weeks. They were able to go on the road and survive a tough one against Wisconsin, like Ohio State did against Nebraska, for example. The good teams will sometimes not play to their A level, but they will show their toughness and they will show their resiliency and talent and coaching by finding a way to win. This is what Ohio State did last year against Nebraska. It's what Oregon did against Wisconsin, nearly got that mixed around. It's what Nebraska, for example, couldn't do for much of the year until they played Wisconsin, and even then, that wasn't a close game. It's what Michigan barely did by really the width of a hair against Ohio State on the road, and they couldn't do that for much of the year, losing in choke job fashion to Washington and Illinois. I'm rambling on here, and I've spent almost 10 minutes talking about Oregon in 2024. But it's important because I feel like whether it's recency bias or the fact that conference championships in many people's eyes have been tainted and disincentivized due to the expanded playoff, I don't feel like a lot of people view Oregon's season as successful as it was. I mean, I would give Lanning, honestly, an A grade last year. Not A plus, but I would give him a better grade. If you care about the regular season at all, I think he gets a better grade than every other coach in the Big Ten. Day won the national championship. Absolutely. And we're going to use this as a segue into Oregon's 2025 roster season and also their schedule. A lot of these things are up on the screen for all of you. Day won the title. I think Day is the best head coach in America when it comes to playoffs only. The way he motivates his teams and gets them up for playoff games and schemes in the playoff is like no other. No other, straight up. Only Kirby Smart can rival Day in terms of playoff preparedness. I think it helps Day that he has more explosive receivers and typically better QB play than Smart does, and I think a lot of that especially comes alive in the playoffs when you're at indoor facilities or neutral sites, and therefore you have more of an opportunity to make it a track meet. But still, I think Day's a better head coach than Lanning. That's not what I said. What I said is that if you care about the regular season at all, Lanning beat everyone he was supposed to beat, and then beat an Ohio State team and Penn State team who at the end of the year per FPI were power rated higher than his team, and Ohio State in terms of NFL draft picks or what if NFL draft picks, which factors in high school recruiting rankings. It's like, what if high school recruiting rankings was the only thing that determined NFL potential? High school recruiting rankings, the fact that Day was in year 6 and Lanning was in year 3, and yet he beat Ohio State and he beat Penn State, who were, by end of season power ratings, the two best teams in the Big Ten last year. If you look at FPI, if you look at S&P Plus, Ohio State was 1 and Oregon was 2 in the Big Ten. Penn State was 3rd. But I digress. The point is, Lanning beat the teams he should have beaten, and Ryan Day honestly should have beaten Oregon the first time around, seeing how good that team was in the postseason, the high-octane level of talent and potential they had, and he obviously should have beaten Michigan, and he should have beaten Penn State and Nebraska by more. It's just facts. Now, he performed better in the college football playoff, and it's good that the playoff, from his perspective, was expanded, and I think Ohio State's national title is completely legitimate. However, not a rebuttal to that, but the fact that Lanning did his job better than anyone else in America, outside of maybe, in my mind, I could say maybe Kirby Smart, or maybe Curt Cignetti, or maybe Kalani Sitake or Kenny Dillingham, like guys who did more with less. In terms of the top 10 or top 5 talent rosters in America, outside of maybe Kirby Smart, and even then, with some of the injuries they suffered, with some of the coaching that took place with Georgia's team last year, Lanning may have done the best job out of the blue chip teams in terms of living up to his team's potential on a consistent basis. And that's something to be applauded. Like, you can't ignore the Rose Bowl. No, absolutely not. That's the reason I have Ryan Day as a better head coach than Lanning, for example. But you also can't ignore Oregon's regular season or Big Ten championship game and say, oh, that just doesn't matter because of their final loss. Well, no, it matters. Oregon didn't get what they wanted. They didn't even get a chance to really set their eyes on the prize. They didn't even play it in the semifinals. But they earned that quarterfinal bye by being 13-0 and 9-0. And when you look at their roster build, when you look at whether it's On3 and you look at their current incoming recruiting class that has a over 90% blue chip ratio, number 4 recruiting class. And I imagine, I don't know if On3 does a team talent composite. Correct me if I'm wrong. Someone sent me an article saying it was On3's team talent composite, but I don't know if it was just their recruiting rankings or team talent composite, because there is a difference. But Oregon right now is a top 5 roster, and according to On3, the number 1 blue chip ratio in terms of their 2025 recruiting class, and it might near the number 1 blue chip ratio in all of college football if you factor in the transfer portal rankings and you adjust the transfers high school rankings for their rankings assigned in portal rankings. According to 24/7 Sports, last season, because they have not made their team talent composite yet, Oregon had the number 6 roster with the 5th best blue chip ratio. That number is definitely going to go up since they had the number 1 overall class in 24/7 Sports in terms of quality. Very much like Ohio State's 2021 class, where it wasn't quite the best in America, Alabama's was, but depending on where you looked, it was better than Alabama's in terms of overall quality, average rank per recruit. Oregon's was, exceptionally impressive this season, bringing in 31 new players, as many 5 stars as 3 stars, 25 4 stars, including the portal rankings. And typically portal players are not ranked as highly as high school players. If you were to plot it on a bell curve, there'd be even fewer 5 stars and 4 stars in terms of proportions, and there would be more 3 stars, and even some more players that are just unranked because they're not viewed as valuable. And yet their average rank per recruit, per the composite, including the portal and high school, is a 93.45, the highest in America by a decent chunk. That's crazy. They brought in the most talented class entering 2025, and they return about as much as Georgia, Ohio State, Texas, Ole Miss, and yet I'm not hearing Oregon's name be called all that much. I'm not, and I understand that they lose a ton, and I don't think they quite yet have, in terms of high school talent, the roster that Ohio State or Georgia does, and they're a year behind Texas in terms of roster management, in terms of instituting their system, and they don't have the natural recruiting ground that Texas does. But their over-under win total's 10.5. They're plus 280, I believe is what that says, to win the Big Ten. You can see that on your screen. Plus 900 to win it all. Vegas thinks this is a national championship contender, and I do as well. And when you look at the trend Oregon has taken, 10-3 in 2022 with an awful defense, 12-2 in 2023 with probably the best offense that season outside of LSU with Heisman winner Jaden Daniels. I'm still mad at Brian Kelly for wasting that. Still mad at him for that. And then in 2024, 13-1. And they had more talent on defense than they did in 23, but the unit wasn't as efficient per ESPN's efficiency metrics. And the 2023 team had a way better offense than the 2024 team. If the 2023 Ducks played the 2024 Buckeyes in the Rose Bowl, I'm not saying Oregon would win. In fact, Ohio State probably would win, given how they were more successful in big games than that Oregon team was. They were more battle-tested and had more talent. However, just putting up a finger there, it would have been more competitive because of the superior offensive line, the superior higher ceiling QB play. Bo Nix being picked in the first round. Gabriel was probably overdrafted, I believe, in round 2 or 3. I forget. And then having Troy Franklin, who is a better college and probably NFL receiver than Tez Johnson, who was their wide receiver 1, for example. And then having Jackson Powers Johnson at center and Jordan Burch and other players on the defense. They had a better secondary, I think, in 23 than they did in 24. Maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe I'm spitballing, but it feels like Oregon really overachieved in 2024, and in 2022 and 2023, they either hit expectations or maybe underachieved in different ways. I think Lanning did a really good job enabling this roster to punch above its weight class. An Ohio State fan, an Ohio State analyst, talk show guy, Garrison, who leads the Ohio State Voice of College Football YouTube channel, pointed out before the Rose Bowl that all of Oregon's DBs were basically 5'11" or shorter. That is not indicative of a very talented secondary. And then you factor in that Boettcher was a walk-on. Walk-ons can be good, but still walk-on. And you take into account that Oregon's offensive line had a lot of shuffling going on throughout the year, and Gabriel was a 6th-year senior. This team definitely punched above its weight class. I mean, I just named secondary, linebacker, and QB group, and maybe an O-line group that in terms of blue chip ratio, outside of outside of offensive tackle, and even offensive tackle, they got a diamond in the rough in Johnny Cornelius. At least 3 of those position groups I mentioned were not as talented as, let's say, Ohio State's or Texas's or Georgia's, straight up. And yet Oregon had better regular season records than all of those teams, and in power ratings finished around where Georgia was, and they competed and beat Ohio State the first time around, and they may have competed with Texas if they had the opportunity to play them. Looking at the Ducks' schedule here, they get Montana State in week 1 at home, Oklahoma State in week 2. Northwestern is a road game, and I think it's actually going to be is it going to be a noon game? I think it's going to be a noon or 3:30 game kickoff. I forget. But it's at Northwestern. That would be a 10 a.m. local kickoff for Oregon if it is going to be at noon. Oregon State they host in week 4. They travel to Penn State to play at 4:30 p.m. Local time, as in Pacific time for Oregon, 7:30 p.m. Eastern time for Penn State. It's going to be the whiteout game. It's going to be very hard to win there. Week 6 they get a bye. Week 7 they host Indiana. Week 8 they travel to Rutgers. 9 they host Wisconsin. Get a bye in week 10. Travel to Iowa week 11. Host Minnesota and USC back-to-back in weeks 12 and 13. And then travel at Washington in week 14. A lot of tough, some underrated games, some games that you're obviously going to circle, like that Penn State game. I think people should circle that Indiana game coming out of the bye. I don't think Indiana's a team to be trifled with, and I'm actually going to make a longer video, much like this one, on Indiana in the following days as well to talk about them, because I think they're being a little underestimated as well. But Oregon, they have a schedule that will present some challenges, but it's a lot like last year's, with the exception of their biggest game of the year being on the road several time zones away as opposed to at home, and the other team is to travel to you several time zones away. So I think 12-0 is going to be extremely hard, much harder than it was last year. But 11-1 is very possible. And in fact, Vegas is telling you 10-2 or 11-1 is the most likely record for the Oregon Ducks. And that will get them in the playoffs, because that means most likely they lose at Penn State and then maybe to USC, Indiana at home, at Washington. They probably beat a team in either Iowa, Minnesota, USC, Washington, one of those November teams, or maybe Wisconsin or Rutgers, since they returned 70% of their production, or Indiana. They beat at least one, maybe 2 of those teams will be competent, and then beat all the other teams that they should beat, to where they'd get in the playoffs at 10-2. I'm confident in that, especially with their record last year and where they will start the season ranked, and with how talented they are. And if they go 11-1, they're definitely getting a home game. This isn't an Indiana level schedule from 2024, where you play no one who's ranked in the top 25 until Ohio State, who was the best team in America, and when you played them, well, you got smoked. Oregon's schedule is workable, and combining that with a young team that might have one of the higher blue chip ratios, or the highest blue chip ratio in America, and on top of that, think of how many top 100 players they have. Think of all the 5-stars they have. Isaiah World, 5-star offensive tackle out of the portal. Matayo Uiagelelei, 5-star who's returning. Devin Jackson, high-level 4-star at linebacker. Na'eem Offord, 5-star out of high school. I think he'll be playing a little bit at corner this year. Could be wrong, but Oregon's super young in secondary. I think he'll have a chance to break through. Same with Trey McNutt, top 100 player who's coming in. When you look at Dante Moore, 5-star out of high school, has been in the Oregon system a year. Oregon coaches have raved about him. And then his backup, like Austin Novosad, highly recruited player. You look at Kenyon Sadiq. I think he was correct me if I'm wrong, top 100 player out of high school. And then Dakorien Moore, 5-star, who should get some playing time. Malik Benson was a 4-star out of the portal. You have Justice Lowe. You have Jurion Dickey. You have Gary Bryant Jr. And then Evan Stewart, who was a 5-star out of high school and was a breakout player for Oregon in different games last year. And that O-line is highly recruited. You got Elijah Rushing. You got Teote, I think is how you say his name. He has so many talented edges. Aiden Breland, Bear Alexander, Amari Washington. I mean, it's not just blue chip ratio. It's not. Like, that is important, but it's more important that you have several top 100 or high level 4-star, 5-star guys combined with good coaching. Oregon has that. This is a team that can reload. I mean, they are much closer to Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, and Texas. They're much closer to being equals of those teams in terms of roster talent. I actually think right now they're better than Alabama there than they are to even a Michigan or Notre Dame or Penn State or heck Miami, who's recruited better than those three schools on an average basis, but still quite isn't close to that top 5 in terms of roster potential and talent. Oregon, year in, year out, if they keep recruiting at this level, will be a national title contender. And if they bring in another class like this past class, I know there's been news about their struggles in recruiting, struggles because they're averaging, once again, above a 93 rating per recruit per 24/7 Sports Composite. If they continue bringing in those caliber of classes, they eventually might have the most talented roster in the country. Straight up. I mean, Oregon and Texas, once you factored in their portal classes, finished with the top 2 classes. Want to know why? They have elite staffs who will always recruit. All of the staffers there have to recruit. They have to be ace recruiters. And on top of that, they have to be good developers at both schools. And they have big NIL checkbooks. And Oregon has established pipelines all across the country. They got some players from Ohio last year. They've been getting players from across the South. They've been able to put a fence up in California, though we'll see if USC maybe challenges that. And then Texas has Texas to recruit out of, and Louisiana, obviously. But we're not talking about Texas. We're talking about Oregon here. They can reload. The question on top of whether or not they will reload, because will is different than can, is how many players break out to contribute. Especially, I think, the true freshmen. I think more than anyone this year, there's a chance for a plethora of true freshmen to break out in college football, specifically as it relates to Oregon, because they're so young in the secondary. They're young at receiver in parts. They're also old there in parts, but the older guys aren't as talented as Moore was coming out of high school. Ohio State, for example, brings in some freak freshmen around the same or maybe a little bit less in terms of quantity compared to Oregon. And on top of that, they're older at DB a little bit, and they have some depth there that they really like. And then they have Jeremiah Smith at wide receiver and a bunch of guys who are older than Quincy Porter Jr. So he probably won't see the field much. Will still be one of the better wide receivers in America because Brian Hartline's that insane, but he'll probably be buried behind the depth chart. For Oregon, this isn't the same case. Oregon is one of the youngest teams in the country, especially in positions where they earned commitments of freak athletes. I mean, in the D-line, when you go behind their starters, they're all redshirt freshmen or true sophomores. There might even be some true freshmen who contribute to the 2-deep or 3-deep for Oregon. It's the same thing at corner, close to the same thing at safety outside of Thieneman, and also corner outside of Theron Johnson, who I think will be one of the better corners in the Big Ten this year. They do lack experience, sure. A lot of teams who also were in the playoff last year do entering this year. Georgia, Ohio State, Texas, Ole Miss, who missed the playoffs because unlike Oregon and Lanning, they couldn't take care of business. And it's a unique opportunity. I think that, and maybe Oregon fans will disagree with me on this, I know that a lot of people are high on Oregon's D-line. Having that much youth and that much production going out the window, and then having to rely on Bear Alexander being your starter with some of the past issues he has had, that's a concern. That's at least something you have to circle and say that could be a concern. I think D-end is really strong. I love Oregon's defensive ends. Tuioti, Uiagelelei. I mean, they return 2 out of their 3 best D-ends, and I think rushing is ready to break out, and they've recruited well there. Obviously, have, I think, developed pretty well there. But you look at especially D-tackle, and I think that could be a concern. And then overall inexperience, and then also wide receiver consistency. You lose Franklin after 23, then you lose Tez Johnson and Trayshawn Holden, and some of the higher level recruits just haven't emerged yet. And then when you have to add Malik Benson in the portal, and it looks like Gary Bryant Jr. might be starting for you, you begin to think to yourself, might there be some inconsistency issues? We'll have to see. But I think Moore will be an upgrade compared to Gabriel, talent-wise, in the same way that Sayin is over Howard. Now, that does not mean they will be better players this season. You can have a higher ceiling and better potential and be a worse player. But they have more NFL potential, those two do, than Gabriel and Howard, respectively. I mean, those quarterbacks are closer to a Drew Aller than they are to a guy bouncing around at UCF, Oklahoma, went to UCLA or wanted to go to UCLA before Oklahoma, and better than a guy at Kansas State who got pushed out by his staff in terms of potential. No disrespect to those players who are legends in their own right. It's just Oregon upgrades talent-wise at quarterback. At running back, I think that Mahki Hughes and Noah Whittington make up a great duo. And you have other players behind them who I think could step up and get some touches. At tight end, Ferguson's gone, Patrick Herbert's gone. I don't think it matters all that much because I think Kenyon Sadiq is probably the best tight end in college football. Super high ceiling, Oregon's tight ends have been well coached, and now he gets a chance to be the alpha in that room. And with some questions at wide receiver, he could be their Tyler Warren. He could. Kenyon Sadiq could be Oregon's Tyler Warren this year. I love their O-line with Isaiah World, Alex Harkley, and then you have Iapani Lalolu, Dave Uli, some other players who are coming back from last year's offensive line. It should be a better O-line, I think, on the interior than last year, at least a little bit, or similar caliber. Tackle is where there are some questions, but I love World. I love Harkley. They have depth, and also they've been trending up in recruiting on the offensive line as well. You look at the end, we've already talked about that. Linebacker with Boettcher coming back, and then Devin Jackson replacing Jeffrey Bassa. I love that. And their staff, minus defensive coordinator. If you haven't watched my channel before, let's just say I think that Tosh Lupoi's time at Oregon is going to come to a close. And I think that if it doesn't, then I begin to have doubts about whether Lanning will win a national title or not. The guy's a liability. But outside of that, I love the staff. And there's a potential that the DBs and wide receivers, the true freshman ones, could be strengths for this team. They may not be Jeremiah Smith or Colin Simmons, but maybe they can show some freakish athleticism, or maybe they can be close to those two, even one of them, and that totally changes everything. Especially as the year goes on and those young players get more used to the system, and then players who are older than them but still relatively young compared to the average college football player, sophomores, redshirt freshmen, some juniors, things just begin to click. And I think with Oregon this year, I strongly believe that Moore, both Dante Moore and then Dakorien Moore, quarterback and wide receiver, I think they'll have a great connection. And I think that Na'eem Offord and Trey McNutt at corner and safety are going to break out too. I think that this is the year of the true freshman for Oregon. Now, what I will say to kind of close this video out is I do not believe that this is Oregon's season to win it all. I think they're a little bit too young, and they have some questions in certain areas. And it's no fault to their own. I'm not picking Georgia or Ohio State or Alabama to win it all this year. I think it's kind of a race between Penn State and Texas right now. And while Ohio State, Oregon, Georgia, and maybe Bama, if things pan out there, maybe they can be involved in the race, and maybe some others too. I just think that Texas has the best constructed roster in terms of recruiting, on top of having a potentially generational QB in Arch Manning and returning a lot of stars from, according to ESPN's FBI, the best defense last year, according to my eyeballs, the second best behind Jim Knowles' Ohio State unit. And then Penn State, well, they have Jim Knowles, the nation's best DC, Kotelnicki, who I think is the nation's best offensive coordinator. And they return a lot of stars a few NFL draft picks that could have declared last year, like Zane Durant, Denida Sutton on the D-line, and then the 2 running backs, Singleton and Allen, and then the quarterback, Drew Aller, and they return more. But Oregon can win it all this year. And I think that weeks 1 through 5 will look worse than weeks 7 through 9. And that weeks 7 through 9 will look worse than 11 through 14. And if this team gets into the playoffs, I think that they may look night and day different from what they were in week 1, in almost a strong juxtaposition to last year, where I convinced myself that Oregon in week 1 and week 2 of 2024 was gone, and it reared its ugly head immediately in the Rose Bowl. You saw the O-line. Oh, yeah, that had some limitations. You saw that wide receiver and QB did. You saw that running back did. You saw the defensive issues that plagued them in the Boise State game, or even the Penn State game, or the first Ohio State game, allowing huge plays even when you're changing things up or trying to change things up. I don't think that'll happen if Oregon reaches the playoff this year, even though their staff is the same, and even though I still have questions about Lupoy, and that's one of my reservations about picking Oregon to win it all now or while he's still there. I still think against Montana State, Oklahoma State, Northwestern on the road, Oregon State at home, and especially Penn State on the road, that's the week 1 through 5 slate. All those games are taking place in either August 30th in week 1, or through the rest of September. I think this team will look a little bit rough. I think there's a chance Oklahoma State maybe plays them close for a half, and the stadium's nervous, has nervous energy. I think that Northwestern might hold them to some low point total before Oregon pulls away. I think that against Montana State and Oregon State, talent alone will help them blow those teams out, but you'll see some things that tell you, yeah, I don't think this team's the best in America. I think that Penn State right now should be favored to handily beat Oregon. It's a bad matchup. Straight up. Penn State upgraded at wide receiver. They had issues at DC last year. Allen was far from perfect. They got Jim Knowles. Kotelnicki will be in year 2. They lost a great running backs coach in Sider to Notre Dame, and they upgraded with Stan Drayton. And then they brought all of their key guys back except for Abdul Carter and Tyler Warren, which is a pretty big deal. But upgrading the way they did at wide receiver and the way they've recruited and developed, especially in the trenches for recruiting and development D-line recruiting on the O-line. Penn State's blue chip ratio on the O-line is over 70%, and they have several 5-stars there now. I think they have 2, and then the vast majority are high-level 4-stars. Point being, I think it's a bad matchup. I think Penn State's more experienced. I think they have the better coaching staff. It's several time zones over, and Oregon's going to have to face an environment that is as loud and as intimidating as theirs. They are going to be last year's Ohio State walking into a hostile environment. And unlike last year's Ohio State, which was very experienced, very much so, and had a freak wide receiver in Jeremiah Smith and a freak safety in Caleb Denz, I don't think Oregon has those right now. But after week 6, after the bye, I think against Indiana, the team will look better than it did against Penn State. And I think really after those week 7, 8, 9 games against Indiana, Rutgers on the road in week 8, and Wisconsin at home, I think out of that bye, out of November 1st against Iowa on the road, that's tough. I think that'll be a test of Oregon's mental fortitude because it's a tough place to play, and I think Iowa will finally have an offense. But I think that could be a statement win. I think that Minnesota at home, they'll look better there. USC, I think that'll be a statement win, much like it was back in 2023 when they hosted them and beat them handily. And then Washington on the road in week 14, that'll be tough. But if this team is improving every week like I think they can, and like I think they should, and like I think they will, same goes for a lot of these other teams like Ohio State and Georgia, who enter with not a lot of experience, and the more reps they get, the more snaps they get, the better they will get on average. I like Oregon's chances. I do, to finish out the year strong, maybe after a loss to Penn State, or maybe they go 12-0 again, or maybe 10-2, or maybe they go, dare I say it, 9-3, and they enter 2026 as being slept on, and they're the best team in America then. I think at the end of the day, Oregon cannot be underestimated. They can't be. Underestimating Oregon comes at your own peril. It's not wise. It's not a good decision. Not one bit. Make sure, again, to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Last thing I will say before we get off here is that another thing that limits Oregon's capability to win it all in 2025, and this is the case, I think, with all the teams that lost a bunch last year, is because of the portal and because of the top teams in terms of recruiting leveling off a bit, same with depth, injuries are devastating. They are more devastating now, I think, to the top teams than ever before. Combine that with playing longer schedules, unless you return a ton, like last year's Ohio State team, and even then, they got some injuries, and it handicapped them or nearly handicapped them in certain situations. Or unless you are this year's Penn State, or I don't know, maybe Texas in the future returns a lot of guys, or Georgia does. Georgia returned a lot last year, and they got handicapped by injuries. Injuries are more of a threat to a team's success now than ever, in my mind. And with Oregon being this young, I think that there's a chance that Oregon, much like Ohio State and Georgia and all these other teams I'm mentioning who are young outside of Bama, who's a little bit older, those other teams that are in the top 5 talent composites, and Texas I think is also older too. I think their roster's a little bit more balanced. But the other 3 in particular, there's a chance that they get better with more experience and they trend up, but then in November they begin to plateau or even fall off because the injuries and the fatigue begins to accumulate. This could especially be the case in the playoff. Not saying that's what's going to happen with Oregon, but there's a good chance that that will happen, so keep that in mind. Ultimately, I don't think this is Oregon's season to win it all. I think that they're going to have to wait until a few seasons after the fact. I think a lot of Oregon fans are understanding to that based on what I've seen. Regardless, though, I will say they can win it all this year. They will be competing for a title, and I do think it's much more likely than not that they will make the college football playoff and probably win a game, given I think at 10-2 or 11-1, it's more likely they'd get a home college football playoff appearance than not. Imagine hosting a playoff game in Autzen Stadium. I mean, that's an overpowered home field environment. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you all very soon. Make sure to hit the notification bell, comment your thoughts down below, and hit the notification bell as well for the Oregon podcast. You'll see it linked in the video description, I believe, or somewhere in there. It's an Oregon podcast that I run. It's just a playlist of all the Oregon videos I have. That way you can get notified when I release more Oregon-specific content. Have a great day, and I will see you all soon.